I'll do the intro. I've got my regular notes here.
Okay, we're recording. Go for it.
And for those who are just coming in now, wondering what's going on, in honor of parking reform, we managed to somehow convert this meeting into a home meeting after all, or whatever we did. Anyway, we cannot get inside the Kavanaugh Center. There's a group on the steps of the Kavanaugh Center participating on Dan's computer. The rest of us have gone home and will participate from there. At this point, I typically acknowledge dignitaries who have joined us, but I've noted Mayor McDonald is there, Councilmember Posake, thank you. Oh, I see Planning Commission Chair Blake Hooper has just shown up. Very good. Planning Commissioner Heidi Bauer was there at one point also. So thank you all for being here. Quickly mention some dates for Urban Chat. This coming Friday, we're doing an Urban Chat mixer at the Rachel and Colin Thomas house. My understanding is that we can get a few more people there. There's room for a few more. If you want to reach out to Rachel or reach out to me for Rachel's email address, there is still that opportunity to join us for casual urban conversation, drinks, etc. The next KBYG, which I think will be at Kavanaugh Center, but we need to talk about that tomorrow morning, Dan, will be September 13th. The speaker will be Paul Pitangaro, and I'm never sure I pronounced that correctly, talking about SB 9, which is the state legislation to allow easier split of lots with the creation of additional homes. And then the big dates coming up are going to be September 20th and 28th. We're putting together a Better Cities Film Festival. The first date will be at the Boulevard Cinemas. The second will be at SRJC Petaluma. We have a great list of sponsors. You're going to see posters starting to go up around town this weekend. We have about 300 seats to sell. We really want a good crowd, good conversation. Let's energize conversations in this town. Now, on to our speaker, who was always going to be on Zoom. The rest of us thought we were going to be doing something different. Tony Jordan is the founder and leader, whatever your title is, of President, okay, of the Parking Reform Network. It is a nationwide, it's based in Portland, but they have a nationwide reach arguing for improved parking management, reduced parking minimums, or elimination of parking minimums. I've had several conversations with him at CNU, at Strong Towns. I like what he has to say. I've always liked that message. He spoke on earlier today. He's done some really interesting research on the North Bay, which I'm looking forward to hearing. And probably the best thing I can say about him is how I came to be in contact with him is I reached out to Donald Shoup saying, who do you think we should get for a conversation in Petaluma? And his response was Tony Jordan and the Parking Reform Network. There's no higher honor to be given. So Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I hope you guys are all comfortable. Hope the weather's good. And I hope you can hear me. I'm here to talk, as mentioned, about equity and climate action. What's parking got to do with it? And as mentioned, I'm Tony Jordan from the Parking Reform Network. So I don't know who I can really see. The Zoom thing is a little bit, weird. Hold on. I also can't even change my slides. Okay, there we go. So I'm just gonna get a little bit of a feel from what I can see in the limited space here. Just for amongst yourselves, prior parking knowledge. So if you think you're a Shoupista, or maybe you're not even a Shoupista, but you think you're a parking expert, you can raise your hand so we can see who maybe is a Shoupista or an expert. Okay. Maybe you know a little bit about parking, like you've started to read this new book, Paved Paradise by Henry Graybar, or you've read an article or two about parking. Raise your hand or do that. Cool. And it's pretty new to you. I mean, you know about parking because you drive a car and you park, but you've never really considered the deep nitty-gritty details about where we're at. Who's a newbie here on parking? Anybody? Okay. Well, for those last two categories, this is a little bit of warning, which if I'm doing my job right here, this might change your life. It's certainly this knowledge that I'm going to give you did change mine. I didn't start out running a parking reform network. It didn't exist, but a bit like the protagonist in They Live, Roddy Piper, when he puts on those glasses and realizes that the world is run by alien monsters, I can't look at a parking lot any longer without seeing basically piles of burning cash or the ghosts of what was there before or the promise of what could be there in the future. You might find yourself being that person at a party who wants to bring up this weird issue of parking policy reform, or at a dinner, and you're kind of afraid no one wants to talk to you. But I do have some hope for you, just like the protagonist of They Live finds a group of people who also know about this. We're building a nationwide community of this, or an international community that are interested in parking reform, and we throw great parties, and increasingly there are people who will commiserate with you. A little bit about me. You heard some of this, but who am I? I'm Tony Jordan. I live in Portland. I'm a dad. I've got 2 kids that are, teens. I ride a bike a lot. I'm a rabble rouser. Haven't had a car since 2008. I went to school at UC Santa Cruz. I grew up in San Pedro in Los Angeles, and I mostly worked as a software developer, and I also worked for a bit as a union organizer, which helped me to do the work I do. The Parking Reform, in 2019, I founded the Parking Reform Network, which is a 501c3 organization. At our core, we're a community of activists, practitioners, partner organizations working to advance parking reforms and educate the public about parking reforms. We do this through research. We have a map of where mandate reform has happened and where other parking reforms have happened. We have a map of parking lots in central cities. We have research products. We work on messaging. And as an organization, we are grounded in organizing and action, helping people to take action at their local and state levels. So why did I pick parking? Like, how did I get into this? And sorry, I know probably some of these slides are small if you're sitting there. And these are great artworks from Andy Singer, who's a great comic artist. I picked up this book in 2010 called The High Cost of Free Parking, and it blew my mind. Like, I never had thought about why parking existed and what its impact was. As I read the book and looked around, I realized that it had a profound impact on housing and traffic and just our built environment and climate change. It's something that has been ignored for too long and causes a lot of issues beyond just the obvious ones. So how did we get to this place where we have these sprawling parking lots and a housing affordability crisis exacerbated by parking? And it kind of starts with these things we call parking mandates, or you might hear them called parking requirements or parking standards. They're arbitrary ratios. If you want to start a business or build a building, usually the city or county is going to tell you you have to build some parking. So what do these look like? My favorite example is bowling alleys. If you want to build a bowling alley near you in Petaluma, how much parking do you need? In Rohnert Park, you need 2 spaces per lane. In Yuba City, you need 3 spaces per lane. In Novato, 4 per lane, plus any that you might need for a restaurant or a bar or anything else. Petaluma, you need 5 for each alley, which I believe is just another word for lane. It's a little confusing because it could be the whole alley, but I'm pretty sure it's per lane. Folsom, 6 per lane. In Vacaville, 1 per 300 square feet. Now, I've done this around the country. They vary. I've seen 10 per lane. I've seen 1 per lane. Why? What could possibly justify in one geographic area a range from 2 to 6? It's like a strike here, right? Do people in Rohnert Park carpool to parking and people in Petaluma don't? Is Folsom trying to discourage bowling alleys? Do they drive to carpool to bowling? Are they trying to discourage new bowling alleys because of the amount of parking that's needed, or not? Why? Well, the real answer is these were kind of made up. Back in the 50s, when we started building freeways everywhere and sprawling suburbs, people realized they needed places for people to park, and the cities weren't really interested in doing the job of managing the curb. They still aren't today. Hint, hint. But we have this planning advisory service from 1954, where an architect in New York says that it's doubtful that any 2 planners or architects could ever agree on how much parking should go in a shopping center or for one type of business. And they just actually admit, they just guess a number, and invariably it's too much or too little. This goes on. Let's look at funeral homes in the area, right? You want to build a funeral home. Hold on, my slide is stuck. Okay. Santa Rosa, you need 1 parking space for every 4 seats. In Petaluma, 1 per 5 seats. Viejo, 0.2 per seat. You often see this. That's just a fancy word for 1 for 5, but they like to mix it up in the zoning code. Vacaville, 1 per 100 square feet of assembly area. Windsor, 1 per 500 square feet of floor area. Yuba City, 1 per 40 square feet of assembly rooms used for services, but in no cases less than 10 spaces. And not to just pick on places that have parking requirements. San Francisco has almost no parking requirements, but they do have one. For a mortuary, you need exactly 8 parking spaces. Once again, why? What could justify this? Do people are funerals in Yuba City do they have a lot more people that drive? Because that's 10 times more parking they're requiring than in Windsor. Planners could be using tarot cards or reading bird guts to make these numbers up. And that would be funny, except they got encased in the code, right? They're in the zoning code all around the country, and it doesn't change very often. And the result is the sprawl and the pavement and the lack of economic opportunity and development that we see in our cities. I want to just pick on California. There's a little town called Woodbury in Georgia. It's in The Walking Dead. They didn't film it there, but that's supposedly the name of the place. And this place is small. The biggest thing in the city or the town is a graveyard. This place has a list of parking requirements you wouldn't believe, including for a hospital, 4 per bed plus 0.72 per employee, like not 0.73 or 71, 0.72. For a high school, 0.26 per student plus 1.2 per employee. I hope they're teaching algebra at the high school there, because you need it to figure out your parking requirements. This place has, once again, there's nowhere you would, like, if you wanted to go to this place in a helicopter, you'd land in the graveyard. But they have 2 parking requirements for helicopter parking, heliports and helistops. Hell if I know what the difference is between those 2 land uses. And you see this everywhere. There is parking requirements for parking. I was in North Carolina for CNU. We found parking requirements for drive-in movie theaters, right? No one's making a drive-in movie theater anymore. And if you did, would you need to tell them that they have to have a parking space for the car to drive into? No. And in Washaba, Minnesota, that we found a parking requirement for parking garages. So like it's nuts. And my favorite example, and then we'll move on, is SeaTac, Washington, which is basically an airport town, has a parking requirement for butterfly and moth breeding facilities. And I've looked through the code, and they don't have one for ant farms or worm bins. So it's pretty arbitrary, and who knows? These are ridiculous, but it's not a laughing matter, right? This leads to serious problems on the ground. We have places where it's easy to get to, but they're non-places. No one really wants to stay in them. And there's a cycle of more parking, more traffic, wider roads, things farther apart, transit and walkability don't work, and so on and so on. As I mentioned, this parking costs a lot, right? It's not free. A lot of people don't recognize how much parking costs. So a surface parking space is in the thousands of dollars, $5,000 to $10,000. Now you're going to find numbers all over the place. It depends on a lot of stuff. And these numbers don't generally include the price of land. So $5,000 to $10,000. An above ground parking space is in the tens of thousands of dollars, 20 to 60, but we see them up as high as 80, 90, $60,000. And a rule of thumb is that for every $10,000 in construction cost for a parking space or anything for a building, you need about $100 in rent, either for the tenant or the business that's moving in there. So a $40,000 parking space is going to add about $400 a month to the rent. Underground parking, which people think is a solution to some of the issues with parking, is about 2 times as much as above ground parking. So it costs tremendously more, and it takes up and it can really restrict how much housing you can build on a site. And these costs aren't just evaporated. The developer doesn't just pay, people pay. And we make real decisions in how much parking we build or require. So there's an example here in Stamford, Connecticut, a stark example. The government has built a parking garage a parking structure at the Park and Ride. It's got about 900 spaces in it, $88,000 per car. It costs about $90 million. And that's so probably a banker or an executive that lives in Stamford can go drive still to the Park and Ride and take the train part of the way. In the same town, there is this 72 Franklin, permanently deeply affordable housing. Houses about 120 people. doesn't have 120 apartments, but about 120 people live in it. It costs $9 million, no ongoing subsidy, $77,000 a person to house someone in the same town where our government spent $88,000 so someone could park a car while they go to work. These are decisions we're making. We make them every day in how we use our resources and how we plan our cities and what regulations we choose to enforce or impose. The space, right? So you have the cost and the space, right? These are like the equation of the impact of parking. The space, a parking space takes up 300 to 400 square feet, depending on, and it's getting bigger all the time because cars are getting bigger. So there's aisles, etc. The decision we have is, do we want living space or parking space, right? At 300 or 400 square feet, 2 parking spaces, 1.5 parking spaces, which is commonly required. We'll see that in the next slide for housing. Is about the same space as an apartment building, as an apartment in the apartment building could be. Often the limiting factor to what can be built on a site is not the zoning even, it's actually how much parking you're requiring. There's a guy, Mott Smith in Southern California, who says, parking's like pizza. You can sell it by the slice, but you have to bake it by the pie. So a lot of times what happens in parking requirements is you have a requirement per apartment and you want to add 2 or 3 more apartments, but it would tip it over to where you'd have to build a whole new level on the parking garage. So you just throw those apartments away or you don't build the building at all. So let's look around the area for what multifamily parking requirements. And there's some caveats here. There might be special districts. These are just the straight base zoning requirements in cities around you. Vallejo, 1 per unit. Healdsburg, 1.5 per unit. Folsom, 1 5/10 per unit. Once again, that just got to have a different word for it. Petaluma, 1 per bedroom, no less than 1.5 per unit though. Sonoma County and Santa Rosa are 1.5 per unit, 2.5 per 2-bedroom plus. We're getting more complicated here. Vacaville, 1 per studio or 1 bedroom, 2 per bedroom, 2 per 2-bedroom, and 1 per 3 units for guests. So if you don't have a car and you don't have any friends, you're going to be really paying for parking. Let's go into the more complicated ones. I had to go into scientific notation for these, I think. Yuba City, 1 per 1 bedroom, 1.5 for a 2-bedroom, 2 for a 3-bedroom, 1 for every 10 units for guests. Rohnert Park, 1 per 1 bedroom, 2 for 2 bedrooms. Sorry, I'm reading this, 2.5 for 3 bedrooms. And then if you have an extra bedroom, you have to put another parking space in there, and there's 1 for 4 units for guests. We get down to numbers like 1.75, 2.2 for 2 bedrooms in Novato. Napa has 3 whole categories, depending on how many apartments are in the building, ranging from 1.2 to 1.6 for a 1-bedroom. And then for guests, they require 2 or 4, depending on where it goes. I mean, it's crazy. It's giving you a headache just looking at this. It gives me a headache compiling it. And when you multiply these numbers by those other numbers, the cost of a parking space and the space it takes up, it really becomes stark at how much we're impacting our housing production by keeping these parking requirements in place. For 60 years, we've required these mandates. And it's so much parking. We've done a study now. We have about 83 cities that we have on our website. And about 25% of your average downtown city is taken up by parking. It ranges from almost 50% in San Bernardino to 12 or 3%. San Francisco, older cities that were built mostly before cars have a lot less. But it's a huge amount of parking. And what is the impact of that beyond some environmental concerns is that you end up with, the sprawl, places, once again, that you can drive to, but you don't really want to be at. They're not walkable. We look at the main streets we love to be at, the types of commercial development that we know is traditional. And that picture on the top, you have a bunch of businesses. Most places in the United States have stopped requiring parking on main streets because they know they're impossible without it. But if you want to build any new commercial, you have to build it like the picture below, which probably have about the exact same number of businesses in the picture. But in one place, you're going to walk around and enjoy what you're doing. And the other, you're going to drive in and get out as fast as possible. And if you don't have a car, good luck at buying anything in that shopping center on the bottom. There's environmental impacts, of course. That's why I got into this issue largely. Climate change and more parking is more driving. And we know that personal transportation is a huge contributor to climate change. And so by mandating parking with every new building, we're just kind of continuing to double down on that problem. Urban heat islands, the big one now. I mean, even I've been doing this presentation for, about a year, and it just gets more important every day. I mean, this is a picture, this is a heat map of Portland from about 10 years ago. Now, just last week, we hit 108 degrees in Portland, our first 108-degree day in August ever. Our third time we've hit 108 ever in our recorded history. The other two were last year. So this is, maybe a cool August day in the future. Research associate Ryan Martin from PSU did a map of every parking lot in the entire city of Portland. He found actually 20% of the city of Portland, the actual city area, is parking lots, which is interesting when you think about those maps I showed you before. The downtown of Portland is actually pretty good. It's only 12% parking in the downtown of Portland, but there's so much parking in everything that's been built since 1960 or so that the entire area of the whole city is 20%. So I overlaid this map on the heat map, and you might not be able to see this very well, but basically it's pretty clear each of those parking lots is contributing heavily to the nighttime cooling problems we see in the daytime temperature heat island effects that are, we know, so disproportionately impact people with lower incomes, BIPOC communities, people who live in places that don't have a lot of trees. It's a big problem. Water quality. It's expensive and it's a big problem. So this is a map of the land use changes from Norman Garrick at University of Connecticut from 1960 to 2000, just showing basically, you don't need to look too closely, but all that red is parking, and it's really, they've done Hartford. This isn't Hartford. And they've since reformed their parking, but they did a lot of damage before then. And coincidentally, there's the South Hartford Conveyance and Storage Tunnel. This is like a subway-sized tunnel that they're building for, I think, $1.2 billion, or they just built it in Hartford to move water off of these parking lots into storage treatment facilities. In Portland, we have light rail. It has to go over a rinky-dink bridge to get across the river. So it's a big bottleneck. We don't have an underwater subway, but we do have a subway-sized tunnel that moves water from parking lots under the river so that we don't dump it into the river instead. And who pays for this? It's not the people who drive in this case to Hartford from surrounding suburbs of Hartford. It's the people in Hartford are paying the cost to build this water treatment facility, or maybe it's federal taxpayers. And of course, the traffic. Parking is a battery for traffic. I often ask people, when they're concerned about my antics or my proposals to get rid of parking mandates, I say, is your traffic bad in your city right now? Do you want more traffic? Because the number one way you can get more traffic is to build a lot more parking. A friend of mine, Kathy Tuttle, says, roads are just really long driveways. If you're charging up these parking garages with traffic, it's going to come out, and then your road's going to get short circuited, and you need to widen the road, which then, it takes a lot of money that you could have spent on other things. And then you're going to probably build more parking and then need to widen the road again forever and ever. Just to reiterate, parking feeds more traffic. More traffic is bigger roads and more parking is more sprawl. More traffic means other modes are slower and more dangerous. More dangerous streets and sprawl reinforce the car dependency. So then you have more cars and more parking. So to kind of sum up some of this first part here, I really want to emphasize that more parking is probably not a community benefit. You build and you require parking, your homes are going to be more expensive. You're going to have more traffic in your neighborhoods. You're going to have fewer trees and green spaces. You're going to have more car owners and less audience for active transportation. You're going to have more runoff and urban heating. You build without parking, you're going to get more housing, and it's probably going to be cheaper. I mean, there's a lot of people who argue about this, but if you have two apartments that are exactly the same and one has a parking space that's dedicated and one doesn't, no one in their right mind is going to pay more for the one that doesn't have a parking space if they're exactly equal. You have lower rates of car ownership. That's been shown by studies from Mike Manville at UCLA. You have potentially more green space and trees. Can't guarantee it, but there's definitely more room for it. You get more density of active transportation and less paved surfaces. all of our cities have these goals. A lot of them are common goals. I think we share a lot of common goals probably here. We want to reduce VMT to our city centers. We want to increase transit and bike mode share. We want to increase housing availability. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Parking's impact on these goals is the existing parking supply already supports too much traffic. If you have too much traffic in your town, de facto, the amount of parking you have is enough for that amount of traffic you have. Building for cars diverts money from other modes. More parking means less housing and more expensive housing, and your transportation and sprawl are major GHG contributors. So I'm gonna give it a sip of water and see if there's any questions real quick. I've given you all the bad stuff. Now I'm gonna give you the hope on the next section of the presentation.
Any questions, anybody?
Got a hand raised in the Zoom.
Wipe out all the parking.
Brian, it's you.
Yeah, I have a question. If minimum parking mandates are so bad, why didn't we ever do it to begin with?
You know, I think, I mean, there's a big question about this. And it hasn't really, I don't think, been super studied. I think it was really like, you know, planners like to have answers, I think is part of it, right? The city wants to have answers. They like to have, you know, the tidiness, rules, you know, and there was a time, I'm sure, before I was alive, when this was starting to happen, when the roads were getting congested because people weren't living near where they did their shopping and working anymore, and it was a real problem. And so, you know, the city had a choice. You know, they could start charging market rates and really manage the on-street parking, which would lead to parking being built in new buildings naturally, or they could just require parking to be built in new buildings. And I think that was an easier political choice for people. I mean, you know, I think I've seen some things where, you know, elected officials, you know, and planning and people work in government can attest, you know, parking, you know, when people get mad about it, they call and they complain, and it's easier to, you know, have an answer that, you know, deals with the problem, even if it's not really a good one.
And we have a kind of devil's advocate question here, which I suspect you're about to answer, but
Oh, I just had a question about what if you take away half the parking and, you know, we don't have great public transportation here. It's very hard for people to get to their job unless they happen to work in town, which is kind of unusual. You know, I have a mom who can't drive and she couldn't really get on a bus and things like that. So just kind of curious what the outcomes have we seen communities where this has happened, and how does it play itself out?
Absolutely. I mean, I do cover that largely. I'll say just real briefly, you know, eliminating your parking mandates doesn't make the parking evaporate. It doesn't, and I'll cover this in a slide. It doesn't ban new parking generally. And the city things take a long time to change, but I'll definitely touch on this. And then if you have a follow-up question afterwards, you can hit me up at the end too, with another, if I don't satisfy it. Anything else before we move on?
I think we're set here, and I don't see any hands up in the chat.
Great. Okay, so fortunately, there is a plan. My good friend, Professor Donald Shoup, has this Shoup dogma, as he calls it. And he's turning 85 tomorrow, by the way, which was a really important birthday number, as you see in this slide here. So the 3 steps to fix this is, you know, stop mandating these, don't ban parking, don't remove the parking, but stop requiring these arbitrary numbers because they're based on nonsense, right? So like, even if you want to encourage parking to be built, setting a prescribed specific number for every land use is clearly not scientific and has led to problems. Price your curbs in the city for 85% occupancy. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then reinvest any money that you make, not just in the general fund, but reinvest it to reduce car dependency and provide additional access options for people who need them. This first one, eliminating parking mandates, is happening. This slide's out of date. We're above 50 now. In North America, more than 50 cities have eliminated parking mandates, most of them since 2017, 2018. These are cities that have transit and don't have transit. They're big cities and little cities. They're in red states, blue states, cold places, hot places, you know, they're all over the map, except for kind of in that whole Midwest section where there's not really a lot of cities in there anyway, right? So and it's a thing that's growing. So this is happening, and it's a little bit new for some of these cities, but we are 5-6 years out in some of the cases, and the results are that the sky doesn't fall. There's even statewide reforms, as you know. In California has AB 2097. My state of Oregon has even more advanced reforms, which are requiring a number of cities. Actually, most of the cities that aren't on the map that I haven't updated yet are suburbs of Portland, like Beaverton and Tigard and other cities, because the state of Oregon is basically requiring cities to either get rid of all their parking mandates or to actually price their curb. And in most cases, they're like, we'll just do this. It's easier to just cross them off the books. AB 2097 is worth a mention. That is the law that went into effect on January 1st in California. It prohibits cities from enforcing parking mandates within a half mile of certain levels of transit, which I believe includes the smart station. And I don't know if I heard there might be another smart station in the northern part, but I wasn't sure if it was open yet. So I just did a circle around this. You can kind of get an idea of where today someone could, under the current zoning, at least build an apartment or open a business without having to build a certain number of parking spaces. But these policies are happening. There's a lot of momentum behind this, but it really is more than minimums, right? Getting rid of your parking mandates is just the first step. It's like if you want to plant a garden, you have to remove the rocks and weeds from the place where you want to have a garden. And then if you don't do anything else, well, you're just going to get more weeds, and after a long time, more rocks, but probably not right away. You have to plant seeds. You have to create the zoning that and encourage the type of development that you want to see, the walkable communities you want to see. You need to encourage that growth by providing transportation alternatives, by providing loading zones, by providing the transit and walkability options that help to foster the kind of development. Because what we do see is that, and I'll have a slide that shows this, if there's not good transit, there still will be a lot of parking built in new developments generally if there's not parking supply nearby that can be used. And you need to manage, threats to that type of garden, that type of neighborhood you want. So that those threats, frankly, are often just excess traffic and more cars. You need to manage the on-street environment and make it so that, you're not just inviting or requiring people to have cars and be dependent on them when they're living in these places, which are usually, the inner neighborhoods or nodes that have resources around them. Cities should mind their own business when it comes to parking. And I mean this very literally. The city owns the curb. And if the city is managing its curb, then the builders and the entrepreneurs and the landlords will not be able to just dump their parking supply onto the street. They're going to either have to provide services or build in places that have good access, or they're going to not have customers and they're not going to have tenants. And the customers and tenants are going to know if the on-street parking is priced, whether they are willing to pay that price and drive, or if they want to take another mode if they can. So the planning department's been requiring this parking, and then the transportation department's giving it away for free. And that needs to come into a better sync. So cities need to mind their own business when it comes to the parking. What does that mean? What's the right price? This was on the other slide, but just to reemphasize, the lowest price that leaves a space or two open on every block is the right price. Like in areas, and not everywhere in the city, because a lot of places there's not a parking problem, honestly. Like usually 1 or 2 blocks away, there is some parking. So you want to have the lowest price that leaves a space open on every block. This is data driven and responsive to demand. So business owners should not be afraid, because if you raise the price too high and people stop parking, then the rule says you lower the price a bit, and it increases turnover and access for businesses. This is about creating this nexus, right? And people might not actually, no one wants to pay for anything, right? Parking, Netflix, ice cream. But if you're charging someone and you're not providing a value, if I pay for ice cream and I don't get it, if I pay for Netflix and it doesn't work, if my internet doesn't work or my phone doesn't work, I'm mad. Same thing when cities charge for parking, but they don't charge the right price, because what value are you providing to your customers? Nothing. You're just charging them so that they can still drive around the block and be frustrated. When you do charge for parking, as I mentioned, you got to reinvest that money. You can't just throw it in a black hole. You got to spend it on things that benefit the people in the area where you're charging for it, or just overall help reduce car dependency in your city. These are usually called parking benefit districts. We have a guidebook about this that we put out. And the idea is usually you start with local reinvestment by investing in lighting, walkability, cleaner streets, things that really like show the people that they're not just, this money's not just, going to pay for who knows what at the city. Some suggestions are better sidewalks and crosswalks, better lighting, transit passes for low-income people, bike lanes, bus shelters. You could add shuttle services for seniors. You could add all sorts of things in here. The sky is the limit. There's a lot of money in parking. And once again, how we choose to spend it and who we choose to charge. Like I know in my city, the price of bus passes just went up and the price of parking was supposed to go up, but they reduced how much it was going to go up because they didn't want to make the drivers mad. And the price of using a bike share went up. So we're making choices about how we price things all the time. It's just this one thing is often kind of considered off limits, and we have to stop and think about that differently. So to the question of what happens when you get rid of parking, mandates, when you get rid of parking mandates, well, first it's the same city it was the day before, as I mentioned, right? Like all in those cities, we looked at those maps with all that parking around. It's still there. The shopping center is still there. Your parking at your house is still there. The parking in the garage is going to take a long time. Garages aren't going away anytime soon at all. So it's going to take a long time for them to go away. And they're usually underutilized. The top deck, I've toured parking garages all around the country. Top deck's almost always empty. So it's the same city it was the day before. So that's one key. What we've seen in some places that did this early, Seattle got rid of parking near transit in 2012. Buffalo got rid of it citywide 2018. The majority of new homes, so more homes are built and they're built because they don't have the parking mandates. So like a majority of the new housing built in Seattle and in Buffalo, since those regulations would have been illegal to build prior to the regulations. But a majority of buildings, even though they don't have to, still provide parking because the stars have to align to get a building with no parking. You need a developer, you need a banker, you need a broker, you need the zoning, you need tenants, and you need walkable area, like you need everything all at once. And it doesn't actually, it happens in fits and spurts. And I honestly would like to see it happen more, but don't worry. They're still probably going to build parking for a while. It unlocks this potential too, shared parking. So a lot of times there's parking nearby, but you can't use it. Sometimes that's because the city says you can't. Those regulations about how much parking you have to build, it's like if you want to build that funeral home, they probably also prohibit the funeral home from using any of those parking spaces. Those big parking lots at Yuba City probably can't lend those parking spaces to a restaurant at off hours or lease them to people who live in a building nearby, because usually it's single-use accessory parking requirements. So when you remove these requirements and these regulations, you allow a market to exist that then can accommodate some of the concerns of people who are worried about parking disappearing. And also over time, you create a revenue stream and ridership base for improved transit and other modes. Equity and concerns about equity are one of the biggest questions, and we take it very seriously. Low-income people. Yes, there are low-income people who pricing impacts them, and there are low-income people who are dependent on vehicles. It's important to recognize, I talk about this all the time, many of the times this issue is brought up, it's not by those communities. Like a lot of transit ride organizations are, a lot of the membership of those organizations are low income, and they are not fighting for parking mandates. So it's important to listen to people from those communities and recognize that there is a large base of people. You look at the census. I didn't look at your counties, but I could tell you Orange County, Florida, Phoenix, like the county in Phoenix, like 40 to 60% of households, and usually it's like 40% of households overall, and 60% of renter households own one or fewer cars. So when we think back to those parking mandates that really quickly went above one per unit, you're requiring extra parking for renters in almost every building. And this is across the country, excessive amounts, especially when you come to multi-bedroom. They say, oh, they don't build multi-bedroom, they don't build family units in these apartments. Well, yeah, because you have to build 4 parking spaces for every apartment for kids that can't drive. Like that's crazy. No wonder you don't have, it's not that, the developer might build studios, but you're not even giving them a chance because they can't fit a family unit on the site. most of the benefits of free parking do go to wealthier people, right? Wealthier people own more cars, their cars are bigger, and they drive them more. This is just a fact. Yes, low-income people drive cars, but they don't gain as many of the benefits. And then when we're under-managing our on-street parking, we're neglecting agency in the fact that time is money. It may be very well worth it for a low-income person to actually pay for parking. They may prefer to pay for parking than drive around the block or park 3 blocks away. Once again, it's a personal preference, but right now we don't give that option. So the status quo imposes most of the costs of driving on people who don't drive. And parking actually allocation, the revenue from parking can be very redistributive. I know California has some rules around how you can charge for things and spend things, but there still are tremendous opportunities to help people get around. And of course, aging and disability are huge concerns. We have on our YouTube channel, we have a panel we did last October with someone from the AARP, someone from Disability Rights Washington, disability justice advocates from California and Oregon. And we had a roundtable discussion. Yes, it's not a monolithic community, right? There are a lot of people who are car dependent, and there are a lot of people who can't drive, right? For reasons of their disability or their income or their age, right? People they can't drive till they're 16, and then they get to a certain point where they can't or maybe shouldn't be driving safely around. So what came out of this was really just thinking about, one, continuing to have a dialogue with the communities, recognize these are not monolithic communities, and the people speaking up the most might not be representing the entire community. And also recognizing that there are trade-offs in access. Providing 1 or 2 spaces for people who can have cars may impact the ability for everyone else who can use universal accesses to get into a place. And to just reiterate, when we're spending that money on the auto infrastructure, we're reducing the ability and the efficacy of other modes of transportation. So it's like, we really have to look at this holistically. And what we're really talking about when these parking reforms happen is that in any given year, a small percentage of your city redevelops. A small percentage of buildings get torn down. Ultimately, I mean, there are booms and things, but a relatively small percentage get redeveloped. And a percentage of those businesses and housing will be oriented towards people who prefer not to drive, of which it's one of the largest demand demographics is for people say housing in these places that don't have parking, it still costs so much. Yeah, because there's a lot of demand for it because it's in places that are nice to be. So there's a huge market for this, and we're not allowing anyone to address it. And the transit's not good enough, right? And people think it's a chicken and egg, but it's not. I mean, I think that really the fact that the city still exists and the car access is still going to be there. If you wait for the transit to be there, it's never going to come, right? And by the time it does come, it's not going to work. The cars are going to be in the way. And if you're requiring 2 parking spaces in every apartment, we know that it's very likely those people are going to own vehicles. And we know that then they're probably not going to take transit unless you're really doing some other sort of really restrictive congestion pricing or some other thing somewhere else. So I strongly believe that, you know, things they're incremental, they happen over time. You know, there's an emphasis on transit oriented development. And I think really you want development oriented towards transit. If you build housing that is lower car, and, you know, your first apartments might have just 25% less parking. And then the next tranche might have 50. And then you're building that ridership so then you can actually have supported and functioning transit systems in your community. But if you try and wait for that to get put there, you know, ahead of time, you're going to be waiting till the heat death of the universe. Okay, so hopefully I've done some convincing of people. And now I'm going to quickly go through just how, if you've been convinced and you think this is good, you got to organize to win, right? This stuff doesn't happen on its own. You got to get out there. And how do we do this? I'm going to give you some tips. So what do we mean by organizing? I mentioned I have an organizing background. It's empowering members and partners to affect change, leveraging personal connections and coalitions to get the word out and build power. Emphasis on action, you know, like who are you going to write to? Who are you going to talk to? You know, and one-on-one communication. I have found, honestly, that most people just have never thought about this cost and price. And when you tell them, they might not come on board entirely, but they might not oppose the policy because they see the logic behind what we're doing. Got to make lemonade from lemons. Parking causes so many problems. There's a lot of potential partners. Pro-housing people like YIMBYs, bike groups, pedestrians, tenants who have to pay for more parking than they want, or, it's bundled into their housing, entrepreneurs, developers, environmentalists, transit riders. The AARP is one of the greatest allies in these reforms. Organizing is really listening to what people want or need and helping to make a connection between their concerns and the issues. And once again, parking's got a lot of issues. So, if there are issues, climate change, you talk about that. If it's traffic, you talk about how the parking's a battery for traffic, housing, the tremendous cost, the restrictions, the pollution, water, heat, and just particulate and air pollution, property rights, right? For the folks that are a little bit on the right, like, why are you telling me I have to build X amount? The government doesn't, if you want to have a coffee shop and provide bad service, the government doesn't tell you have to have a certain number of baristas, right? But for some reason, this one thing, the parking, we're going to tell you exactly how to run your business in this case. And access, really, I think this is underappreciated, but recognizing that the current status quo is not truly accessible, especially if for some reason, a couple years ago, I'll get personal. My wife had a seizure. She couldn't drive. We barely drove at all, but she couldn't drive for 6 months, or wasn't supposed to. A lot of people in this situation will still drive because they have no other options. But you have people all over the place that can't drive or don't want to drive. They don't feel safe driving. They're alcoholics. They're drug addicts. They're having a bad day. And our current system basically requires them to drive, and we have to do something different. So finally, before I go to the very end, also thinking about how we frame the story of parking and talk about it, don't talk about requirements. We have a whole set of slides like these, call them costly parking arbitrary mandates, like it's what they are, or, parking versus car storage kind of, or even the curb lane, right? We talk about the curb lane as the parking lane, but, we need to reframe how people think about it. So it's not the status quo and the de facto thing that just seems normal, because it's only normal because 50 years ago, some architect in New York, threw a dart at a board and put that many spaces at the neighborhood coffee shop. So I'm Tony Jordan, Parking Reform Network. Excess parking ruins cities, and excess is it's qualified for a reason. And I've got, this is a little fun slide I have that just, it kind of sums it all up. Arbitrary parking ratios make housing more expensive and contribute to climate change. Repeal your mandates, manage parking with pricing, and subsidize transit. You guys got a sticker, one of the other stickers I've got, exactly. And we do our membership organization. We are entirely funded by individual donors. I am just barely started to take any amount of income for this. So just in case you're wondering, like, is this some shadow organization? It's really like, I just, I believe strongly in this. And so we have about 500 something members around the country, or international, and it's a growing organization. So yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear what you think.
So while Dave is finding his mute button, I've got a quick question. You don't happen to have any data on what kind of parking requirements Petaluma has for bars? Because you mentioned drunk driving. It seems like requiring parking at bars is a counterintuitive.
Yeah, I mean, I can get it for you in 1 second. I have a document here called Petaluma area parking requirements, bars, taverns, and nightclubs, one for every 2.5 seats. So, what I'll tell you this. I've worked a lot with people in here. I'll close this slide. I've worked a lot with people in Dallas and in Austin around their parking mandates, and in Texas, the government has less ability to restrict specific land uses. So they can't say you can't, like if they have a commercial area, they can't say you can't have a bar in this commercial area. And this, not just Texas, but this, so actually cities, it appears, there's never been a study on this, but I've looked at a lot of parking code, and cities add higher parking requirements for land uses that they don't want. So you want to prevent a string of bars from being together in your city. Well, a great way to do that is to require a parking lot that is, so, I mentioned the space is 300 or 400 square feet. These ratios are usually like 1 per, like seats is uncommon for bar, but it'll be like 1 per 50 square feet or 100 square feet. So a 1 per per 100 square feet parking requirement means that the parking lot is going to be 3 or 4 times bigger than the building, right? So you can't, or 1 for 50 is going to be 6 to 8 times bigger than the building. So you can't put bars close together because the parking's like a dark matter. It's going to push them apart. And there's a lot of times, Shoop likes to bring these up, but because I think it's kind of bizarre that there's a lot of adult business uses in the zoning code. And they're usually a little bit higher as well, because it pushes them to the outskirts of the city, right? It prohibits an adult business, if the parking requirement's higher, from being in an area that is more walkable. So cities often use these requirements in a sort of perverse way, instead of actually kind of, I don't know how else they might deal with it, but instead of trying to find another way to prevent too many bars in the neighborhood, they zone for an area or allow them to be concentrated in one spot by just granting variances, right? So once you've got the requirement in place, you could say, oh, we're not going to let you open that bar over there, but we will let you open a bar on the one area of town where we want to encourage people to drive to and drink.
And can you, talk a little bit about managing parking through restrictions? Petaluma has the 2-hour zones, which seems like it doesn't bring us any revenue except for tickets, which piss people off. And
I mean, there's a place for time for time stays, for time restrictions. I mean, there's a hierarchy of interventions, right? One is, just, setting loading zones or drop-off zones, or adding more disability parking, right? If those are what you need. Time stays can work in places where there's not a lot of congested parking, but you have a problem with, a lot of times in commercial areas, it's employees, frankly. Employees are parking, or business owners are parking their cars where the customers want to be. So by having a time stay, you can prevent local residents and the employees from parking on the street. But it really should all be data driven. If you don't have that 1 or 2 spaces on every block available, then you need to probably then start pricing, and you got to figure out the price by raising it up a little bit and seeing where it goes, and then lowering it. Another restrictive kind of parking management policy is permits, right? Residential permits, and they have a place. I mean, given one or the other, I'd rather you have a neighborhood that allows people to build the amount of parking they want, and doesn't allow, buildings built after a certain point, or people moving in after a certain point, to necessarily park on the street for free. It's not the most fair, but over time, maybe it works out. So permits and metering are great options for managing that and preventing, the tragedy of the commons, or, people are always worried that, business owner, the new business or the developer is going to take over the parking that they're used to. Right. And so some protectionism is, it's fair enough.
If anyone wants to ask questions, feel free to raise your hand or jump in.
I'm Dwayne has one. Hang on a moment.
Well, Dwayne has 2, of course. The thing that I really object to is the high schools having parking, and for the citizens to build these huge parking lots for high schools. I would love to see high schools charge the full cost of parking, and maybe we get the kids on young people on bikes and buses. The second point I'd make is I used to live in Sonoma, and they had a little hardware store on the corner, and people would go there and talk about a 2-hour parking limit. People would go there and they park for 15 minutes, buy what they want, they leave. So over 2 hours, you would have 8 people, customers. Somebody opens up and bought a whole bunch of Sonoma and made it into a tourist trap, and the tourists come in and park for the great 8-hour, 4 hours, 6 hours experience, and destroy the little shop, the little hardware store. And what I worry about is, here we are in Petaluma with a hotel next to a hardware store, and I'm envisioning the same thing happening, that a person doesn't have to park there a full 2 hours to put the hardware store out of business. If they don't get 6 customers per hour, they don't make it.
Right. I think that's where, a lot of cities are really looking at pickup drop-off zones, loading. I mean, especially with COVID, that became a big thing, right? They started zoning little areas for 5, 10, 15-minute pickup and drop off as that happened a lot. So, I mean, I think the key here is there's a lot of ways to solve some of these problems. The most sledgehammer way is to just require, that hotel to have a gigantic parking garage under it, right? Like, I mean, like, there's, if the city's managing the on-street parking so that the customer, the people in the hotel or the people coming for the 5-6, hour experience they're routed to a garage or to an area that's a little farther out. There's pretty proven ways to manage that. And your school one is a great point. I mean, you look at modern schools, the parking requirements, and the amount of driving that goes on. I have a good friend, if you watch TikTok or YouTube, there's this guy, Sam Balto, he does the bike bus, and he's, constantly taking all these kids out on the bike bus. And I mean, he's constantly calling this out. You look at some of these schools and they have like racetracks basically built in them. Like they're building so much access for circulating and dropping off students. And then on the high school level, yeah, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think those are both very valid points. And the requirements, once again, they make that you can't put a school on a smaller site if you have to also cite 1.6 spaces per student, et cetera, et cetera.
I have a question. If you were working on the climate action section of your general plan,
Mhm.
and could have some policies to put into that document by the end of the year, where could you get those policies?
Like traffic management policies or
Like the wish list of policies to put into the document.
that is a man, I wish I had a like easy URL to give you off the top of my head.
So do we.
One thing is feel free to get in touch with some experts on the topic, and we can maybe have a chat and help you formulate a list of that. We love to do that. Yeah, I mean, you can look at other cities. There's Ryan's pointing something out there. I mean, I think that the climate is like, in a way, I've worked mostly with like the housing people, right? And to a degree, the transportation people. And we're just starting, even though I came to this partly from climate concerns, it's a little bit harder to like, draw the action there. And I think that one thing is putting teeth in your climate action plan. Like what is, like if your climate action plan says that you want X amount of drive alone traffic to downtown, 25%, mode split, right? Well, if you're requiring more than, for one, if you do the math, your downtown, if you'd never built another parking space and never had another car trip to it in 30 years, would probably still not be 25% mode split. It's going to be above that. So one thing is just logically, like you have an argument to say you shouldn't build any more parking in your downtown if you're trying to get to a 25% mode split and your current mode split is 70 or 50 or 100%, right? Because like the parking's already there to support that amount of traffic. So I think like one thing I'd love to see is places really like tying those numbers to their goals. Are your goals real? I mean, I sometimes I want to like, kind of just, throw a bomb, not a literal one, but hey, get rid of your climate goals if you're not serious about them, right? Like, like either put it up and make them match with your zoning or your transportation policy or repeal them. Because the officials get to like, I have a climate mayor here in Portland, supposedly, but like he gets to go to these conferences and seem cool, but then our policies don't match up. So like, I don't think people should get to rest on the laurels of a climate action plan that's not implemented.
I'm so sorry, Dan. MTC is about to fund a parking study for our downtown.
Great idea.
One of the issues that we have is we have a lot of people who perceive our higher congested areas as not having enough parking.
Mhm.
I and others suspect that if anything, we have obviously far too much parking in our downtown area. Anecdotally, you look at any of our parking garages in the middle of a random day, and they're usually half empty, if not mostly empty. But numbers don't tend to sway folks. And even telling them that this is more dangerous for their kids or for seniors or going through the reasons this is helpful also tends to fall on deaf ears with certain people. with the organizing that you've done or that others have done through your network, have you found a successful imagery for getting across this idea of, hey, there's actually too much parking?
I mean, I think,
Flip that on its head.
yeah, I mean, so we've started to look at, I work a lot with people at Sightline Institute in the Northwest. They put some great articles out. There's some researchers, Katie Gould and Michael Anderson. I know that they're looking at, we did a survey, kind of a literature review of parking studies to kind of show this occupancy. So one thing is really, I mean, you can show the actual numbers, right? You can show the pictures, you can show where the parking is. I think that there is a little bit of a factor here that there are some people, and this is an organizing technique in a way, there are people who are just never going to agree with you. And I think that one thing that it is fair to say is, like, at some point, if I've shown you the data and I've shown you the logic and you still don't agree with me, okay, that's stop waste. I mean, I shouldn't stop spending time fighting with that person. There are so many people in Petaluma who have not probably heard any of this content. So they don't recognize what actually is, and what I have found, and I think this is a lot of why the zoning battles are being won around the country and why parking reform is picking up, is that there's just such fertile ground of people who haven't heard about it. And so in the union, you know, you find in union organizing, you talk to people, and if a worker's really anti-union, you don't fight with them. You actually just try to inoculate other people. So when they tell them, you know, whatever they want to say, you know, they've already heard a little bit of the story. You focus on the people who haven't been heard before. And that would be my advice to people trying to build support for this: is stop fighting with the person who disagrees with you, and get out there and talk to people in your church and in your bike group and in your crew or wherever you do socially. Just, you know, because you're going to find people. There's a percentage of people like me out there who are gonna, you know, like hook onto this, and I see them coming on my network all the time, and they're going to be the champions. And when it comes to the city council hearing, and you have this group of people who get the issue and they're not speaking out of self-interest, and they're giving the good argument, it over time. I mean, it doesn't always win, but it definitely helps you get stronger policy.
Great. Thank you.
Excellent. Dave,
And- yeah, could I jump in with a couple of comments?
please.
Actually, 2 comments, 1 question. Number 1, I'm not sure, Tony, you pushed belonging to the Parking Reform Network as much as you could have. I've belonged for a couple of years, lots of great content, lots of good stuff online. One of those many places where I just wish I had more time to take full advantage of what's there. Anybody who is empowered by what they heard tonight, please consider joining the Parking Reform Network.
You can text PRN to 44321 and you'll get a code to let you join. So that's one thing you could do.
Very good. Thank you. Number 2, if somebody wants to be a leader in parking reform in Petaluma, please talk to me. We are always willing to accommodate folks like that within Urban Chat. We'll figure out how to organize around it, who else we can get you aligned with. But yeah, this has been something we've focused on for years, and we just have never had enough bandwidth. So hopefully tonight helps. And then a question for Tony. Those of you who've been around me for a while have heard me say this many times. I really think we can justify parking meters on several blocks of downtown. And my preferred use for the benefits from that parking meter revenue is to fund a shuttle service to allow more people in the nearby neighborhoods to come downtown without using their cars. That way the business owners lose their argument that they lose customers with parking management, which was never accurate to begin with, but nonetheless, they make the argument. And I think it's good for the town as a whole. Do you know any cities who are doing something like that?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of yes. I mean, like if I think so in our parking benefit district handbook, I'm not sure off the top of my head if any of the case studies show that, but I know I've seen good and bad examples of that, right? I've seen, actually, we have a parking benefit district in town here in Portland that for a while was running a shuttle that was kind of a joke because it kind of ran alongside transit, and I don't think they really had their heart in it. But I know that that's a very common strategy. That's exactly the kind of thing that you could and should use your parking revenue for, is to increase access. I mean, that's basically investing in transit, right? So I think that is a great option. Wayfinding, especially in the early stages, right? When you're first setting up these parking districts, like investing in lighting, right? So that make the walk. So one interesting thing that parking advisory service thing or the planning advisory service I showed you from earlier, 1954, later on in that same page, they say, you know, that they don't think there's a maximum amount of parking you can build at a mall, but they were like, but people won't walk more than 300 feet. Like, so any parking space is more than 300 feet from the door, probably no one's going to park in them unless you make a nice walkway with like some artwork or some plants and things. So like really you do have to, like, if you want people to go to those garages and go a little farther out, you do have to improve and make the experience more interesting. Now that might include, you know, depending on what your zoning is, trying to allow a few more businesses or interesting things to pop up along that corridor too. So that as someone's walking to the parking garage, they're not just walking, you know, along a dead street or a storage unit, right? Like I think you know, and there's an opportunity now, even in places where maybe the adjoining land use is not active, you know, hey, you could take some of those curb spaces and let someone put a food truck or, you know, a parklet or something in them now. So you can, so I think that's one key is like, you know, investing in ways, not only they may not need to be even driven, because a lot of times those parking structures are not even, they're a very walkable distance. It's just the walk is not very attractive, you know. So how do you improve the access for people to just get back naturally as they might, you know, from one place to another?
Thank you.
We have a question back here. Hang on a moment.
That's very nice. The moving podium.
Sorry.
What cities have best in class leased or shared spaces? I've certainly seen lots of businesses in Petaluma, real estate offices. There's a great example where the Bank of America actually has a pay per use because the bank is underutilized. And so what cities have kind of that best in class sort of double utilized or leased space?
You mean like, well, I mean, I think, okay, so are you talking about like a regulation for allowing that or just like where it happens, like where
I'm sort of saying anecdotally, perhaps in your experience, where have you seen perhaps communities really create that communal situation where these empty lots are then becoming available at a price to
right,
make more parking effectively available?
you know, I've had
Certainly have
conversations,
because we have a dynamic, I think, in this town also as well, where we have either arts events or other festivals, right, where we have even a higher concentration of parking flow, and that could be absolutely a way, I think, to alleviate some of the demand.
I mean, so I would say if I was gonna, I don't have a list off the top of my head. If I was gonna look for them, I would look for places that one, deregulate that use, right? So it's legal. They're not requiring the parking, so that you know, they probably, you know, like places that allow for that to be done, right? Does your city actually allow someone to lease the parking that they own? Cities, I know that there's a project here in the Central East Side in Portland where the district is working towards compiling like a clearinghouse, right? Just collect the information. Who's got off-street parking? You know, where is it utilized? Build a list, provide incentives. I know that some cities, you know, have allowed the property owners of lots to kind of tag into the city's own like parking app, right? So that people can pay for parking in those lots just like they would off-street parking. So you kind of turn them into quasi, you know, official parking lots. There's a number of businesses out there that are starting to do this, both for like structured parking in apartments. There's a company called Parkade. There's a company I talked to called Quick Text Pay that is trying to do this with businesses where they like, you know, they contract with individual lot owners to open up their parking on an hourly basis. So I think just kind of a lot, what you should not do is try to allow this through regulation, right? If you tell a developer, we'll allow you to build less parking if you lease parking in a lot nearby, they're almost never going to take it up because the lot owner is not going to want to engage in the lease, and the property developer, it's going to be too much of a headache. And down the line, someone's going to get sued. And so it's best to just kind of like deregulate that and allow, like, I like to say, like, parking's kind of like the car. It's like water's going to find the lowest place. Like people are they're going to find, if there's parking around, eventually people are going to find a place to park in it. And I think that what the city can do is kind of maybe incentivize through, you know, other types of programs, depending on what levers they have to, you know, encourage that opening up of, you know, the lots.
Thank you.
Thanks for your great presentation. Question, what would you recommend, if we were to charge for parking in our downtown? There's all kinds of new ways of metering and enforcing that. What are some recommendations on, you know, cost-effective ways to charge people to park?
I mean, I'm a big fan of apps because parking meters are really expensive. Parking meter companies, honestly, actually, someone went to jail in Portland for being bribed by what's now Flowbird Kale, like to buy the parking meters. And then you get this proprietary hardware, it's really expensive. And then they lock you into a contract. You're basically stuck with them forever. So I think like we're at the time where maybe you can't go completely cashless. So if you're going to buy meters, buy the most generic one and buy as few as possible, but also look at opportunities for, because you'll have an equity concern like cashless, creditless people. They're probably going to a business. So if you have a program that allows businesses to either validate or collect and charge the parking in a convenience store or at a restaurant, and then everyone else is using an app, you can use the money that you're saving on hardware to actually have ambassadors, right? That help people who are elderly use the app, or help people who aren't used to using a computer or don't have a phone, you know, have someone on the main street that can go and, you know, oh, it looks like you're having trouble parking. Let me run your card on here, right? Like, so there's a lot of creative options that actually people would appreciate that because it's more eyes on the street and it's a service that's being provided. So I think, I can't recommend a specific company, but I would, you know, talk to peers and look towards, you know, one that is not going to charge you a lot to change your prices, like, because you want to be able to be flexible. So think about when you're procuring a contract, like, you know, allowing flexibility, allowing price changes, data sharing, or you owning the data, because a lot of how you're going to probably raise or lower the prices is going to be depending on the occupancy of how they're doing it. And enforcement's becoming cheaper too with license plate recognition, you know, and like AI recognizing, you know, whether cars are on the street for too long. And hopefully, I also think like if you build a system that's easy to pay for and makes sense, like don't make people leave after 2 hours, just raise the price a little bit so that you're not driving customers away. If you make a system that makes sense, you won't need as much enforcement because they'll follow the rules, right? People mostly break a rule when they don't have another option, you know, like, I mean, I know there are people who just won't pay for parking anyway, but I think a lot of times people get a ticket because they can't see the sign or there's nowhere to find a place to park. So they end up parking illegally. Ryan, you had your hand raised for a while, I think, in the Zoom.
Yeah, thank you. I want to go back to the question about shared parking. I'm a city planner in the city of Sacramento, and we do a pretty good job about managing other people's parking. We manage about 80 different parking facilities, lots, or structures on behalf of private property owners. To where we manage it, we take some of the cut. And we also, we're updating our general plan right now, and we're looking at requiring any new developments. If they do supply parking, that it has to be available to the public. Now, it is problematic to do that to existing properties because it's kind of a taking in some sense. It's their property. We can't kind of change the rules on them, so we can't do that. But I did also want to follow up on what Tony was talking about as far as charging street parking, not just meters, but also different kinds of permits, residential parking permits, or other permits, which are essentially permission to use the curb, that we use license plate readers. And so folks can pay one way or another, get a permit, and then we enforce it through just having vehicles go through the city, and it automatically reads the license plate, confirms if it's valid or not. So I just want to add that. Thank you.
And actually, Ryan brings up a great point, which is if you want people to unlock their parking lots and let people park in them, but you're still not charging for the on-street parking, that's going to be really hard for them to make any money on it. So like if you, once again, if you're not minding your own business as a city, you can't expect someone else to unlock the parking. I'm also a big fan. I think another frontier here is on actually, we have the stormwater. So like jack up the stormwater costs on surface lots, right? And then maybe you can provide for some period of time, you can provide a discount on that impact fee if it's a publicly available lot. Use whatever. Right now, we usually use these levers to make people build more parking, which is not in concert with our goals. But you can make new levers that you can use in favor of reducing car dependency and getting affordable housing or getting better access to places. So you just have to get your incentives aligned properly, where once the people with the parking are actually paying the true cost of it, you're going to find plenty of ways to twist arms and make them, provide community benefits for the impact they're causing.
Thank you.
We have a chorus of thank yous here.
Well, thanks. I'm glad. Sorry you couldn't be inside, but it was great to talk with you. I'm impressed you all hung around.
I think it would have been hot and sweaty and ugly inside, so this worked out really nicely.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
And Dave, Bruce Hagan here. This has been really good. I wrote my comment in the chat, but just to explain what this is, about a year and a half, a whole bunch of us, including many of the people on this call, decided we need to do something about transportation and mobility and, car centricness and too much free parking and all that. So we ended up getting this engagement with a group called City Thread. I don't know if you know about them, but they probably know about you, formerly Bike Nerds, People for Bikes and such. But the goal is to have a very specific goal, 25 miles of connected active mobility corridors in the next 3 years, with 5 of them coming in the next year. And parking is going to be coming up in a whole number of ways, like don't take my parking away for a bike line, gosh darn it. But also, I'm getting more of a sense of how this matters to downtown, where people are driving in for commerce or maybe driving and dropping kids off at school. Long answer or long question is that this is great. I'm going to join the network. I'll be in touch with you either directly or through Dave and the gang here about how we can take advantage of what you and your network has learned. So thank you very much.
Well, fantastic. Look forward to seeing you in there. Yeah. Great. Well, great questions. And feel free to follow up. Tony@parkingreform.org is my address. I'm easy to find around. And yeah, I look forward to seeing some success in your communities, however you define that.
And Tony, thank you for being here. Thank you for hanging around as we sorted out our venue problem tonight. It worked out fine. And thank you very much for making time for us.
No, great. I look forward to getting the video for this. We'll send it on our mailing list. It's a good one. Thanks.
Excellent.
Thank you.
And Dave, before we sign off here, are we doing Aquas at noon tomorrow, or is that next week?
No, it is tomorrow. You are correct. The regular monthly Aqua or Urban Chat lunch, Aquas noon. Hope to see a lot of you there.
Excellent. Cool.
Okay.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.